Welcome to week 2 of the Introduction to Philosophy and Ethics, PHIL 2103. Now in the first week, we really talked about some kind of cut and maybe a little dry concepts that just serve to introduce you to what philosophy is all about. This week, we want to look at some philosophical tools that will help you to have some hands-on ways to actually understand philosophy and interact as a philosopher. Philosophy helps us to understand the world around us, and it employs things that we can actually look at as tools, per se. Philosophers not only try to explain the world around them with the help of claims and stories, but also try to defend their claims with the help of arguments. We start to philosophize, says Rauhut in your book, when we present arguments in defense of our big picture view of reality. Now in the first week we talked about theology, we talked about philosophy, and how each is a big picture view of everything. So I want to ask you, start thinking to yourself, what is a big picture view of reality that you argue or could argue for yourself? Perhaps it falls in line with Christian thinking, and your big picture view is that there is a loving God who created everything and is both immanent and transcendent. That is, he is both in the world working with us, but he is also outside of the world, bigger than we can imagine. Or perhaps your big picture view of reality is that there is no God. Or perhaps we cannot know if there is a God. These are all big picture views of everything that we'll start to take into focus. Rauhut says, being a good philosopher involves listening to questions others have and modifying our ideas in light of these questions. Philosophy flourishes when people feel comfortable to question each other in an atmosphere of mutual trust and respect. And again, I want to hammer in this idea that in this course you will be dealing with different viewpoints other than your own. The goal as a philosopher is to meet them with mutual trust and respect, to analyze them, to ask questions, to see how it interacts with your own big picture view of reality. For example, one of the questions that philosophy asks is whether or not certain things like souls, God, time, or even numbers or colors truly exist. So for just a moment, take a moment in your own brain, just ask yourself the question, does time exist? Do colors really exist? These things that we take immediately for granted. I mean, my watch says it's a certain time, but if you're in a different time zone, why would your watch say it's a different time? Or perhaps I see this board as green, but if you're colorblind, this might not look green at all. So if we have different perceptions of reality, how can we know what is truth? The practice of philosophy, then, often means that we become unsure of whether or not the things that we believe are really true. This doesn't mean that we sink into some idea where nothing can be true, but we question our own views of reality so that we might come out stronger on the other end. Again, one of the things that was great about my time at Mid-America was I had a professor or two who simply looked at me and said, "Why do you believe what you believe?" I had taken my view on God and I'd never really questioned why I believed. And so when I got into an argumentation that I'll tell you about in a little bit with a gentleman I worked with, and he started asking me that why question, I had no answer for him. So philosophical tools provide us the ability to look deeper into ourselves, into the world around us, and start to develop a big picture view of what we have. So let's talk about these tools. The first of these is logical consistency. Logical consistency requires that any claim that is made must be true at the same time. Meaning, if there is two claims and each one is an opposing viewpoint, these cannot be consistent with one another. So if I say it is 10 o'clock where I am and you say, well, it's 11 o'clock, those two things cannot coexist because they're making a claim that's opposite of one another. Reason demands logical consistency. Otherwise, the result is logical inconsistency, which creates contradictions that simultaneously assert and deny something at the same time. If I were to say God exists but God does not exist, those two things cannot be compatible with one another because they are opposites. Rauhut says, the search for logical consistency requires that we also investigate our background beliefs. We are frequently not fully aware of what our background beliefs are, whether they are in conflict with the rest of our belief system. As an example for this, I had a professor who made a hospital call at one point when he was a pastor. He didn't know the individual, and when he came, the individual said, "I want nothing to do with your God." The professor sat down with him and just honestly and earnestly looked at him and said, "Tell me about the God you don't believe in." As the boy started to describe the God that he was believing in, or that he said did not exist, this pastor said, "You know what? I don't believe in that sort of God either. Those background beliefs don't support what I believe to be true." And so we have to investigate what our background beliefs are. Perhaps we say we believe in God, but then we understand that we believe in a God who is completely unjust or unloving, which doesn't match up with what reason and revelation speak to us. Now, the other idea is possibility. Possibility is often confusing to first-time students with this because there are two forms of possibility. If you look in your book, you'll see some great examples of this. The first one is causal possibility. Causal possibility is a state of affairs that does not violate the laws of nature. So for example, I am standing here in this room. It is causally possible that gravity is holding me down. That does not violate the laws of nature. But see, the thing is, causal possibility doesn't tend to be very useful in philosophy, because in philosophy you're trying to question and stretch the boundaries. And so in philosophy, they typically use what's called logical possibility. With logical possibility, it says that whatever we can conceive in our minds as possible is logical. This is useful in philosophy for detecting contradictions. And it says that a state of affairs is logically possible if it does not entail a contradiction. Your book gives a great example of logical possibility. First, it engages in causal possibility and says, could LeBron James take a basketball and throw it over 1 mile? The answer causally is no. It's not causally possible. It violates the laws of gravity, inertia, force, and etc. However, logical possibility says if it can be done in a movie, it is logically possible. So for example, in a movie, you could conceive of a world where LeBron James could take a basketball and throw it over 1 mile. What you could not conceive of is LeBron James both being taller and shorter than me at the same time. That is where we entail contradictions that help us to understand what is logically possible. Because when first-time students encounter this information, they tend to think, if I could see it in a movie, then it's logically possible, then that means that everything is logically possible. But that's not necessarily the case. Again, if LeBron James were standing in frame next to me, he could not both simultaneously be taller and shorter than me at the same time. And so that would not be logically possible. The next philosophical tool that we're going to look at is philosophical definitions. Now, just like causal and logical possibilities, there's two categories. The first of these are lexical definitions. Now, a lexical definition is very simply the dictionary definition. If you were to go to Merriam-Webster's dictionary and look something up, you would be looking at the lexical definition. As with causal possibility, this has limited use in philosophy because, again, they're seeking to stretch our understanding and question boundaries. So what is useful in philosophy are what we call real definitions. Real definitions explain the essential nature or essence of a thing, and they are established by necessary and sufficient conditions. For a deeper look at real definitions and necessary and sufficient conditions, be sure to look at page 21 of Rauhut's book. These are the introduction to the initial tools that you're going to need to understand. But we have several more, so be sure and watch the next video in this series.